compound where they actually struck. Those are individual targets. And they launched some 125 precision munitions using B-1s based in the United States, which is a long haul. It's something we have done before. And also some of those fighter aircraft that we had in the Middle East already that we positioned a couple of months ago. So tactical success on a wide-ranging mission set of targets.
And I want to talk about the mission itself. What is the ultimate goal here? Is it about taking out some military there, or is it about sending a message? Is it kind of a mixture of both?
Well, I think that's a good question, Josh. And I think one thing, let me kind of separate what we hear coming out of the Pentagon, the White House, and the State Department at this time, and then what we should be trying to do militarily. So number one, I haven't heard a strategy, and I haven't heard what the overall objectives of this campaign. This isn't a single set of targets according to the White House and the Pentagon. So what are our objectives for this campaign? And when I look at that, I have to say that, okay, I haven't heard that. And so we need to know that. To be able to answer your question thoroughly, I have to know what those are. But what I see is this is kind of a public relations campaign. Okay? First thing you hear yesterday when we start talking about this is we hit 85 targets. We used 125 munitions. We used a B-1 bomber from the United States. This is a public relations campaign showing the U.S. military's strength and capabilities to strike around the world at any time of our choosing. But did it achieve the objectives that we should be focused on? Tactically, yes, I believe we hit those targets. But broader on deterrence, I'm not so sure we did that. But are we really trying to deter? Because we've had plenty of opportunities to do so. So I have to balance that out between the success that these service members had versus what the administration is trying to say we're doing. So I think, and you're going to see this today, you're going to see a lot of photos come out of damaged buildings, destroyed buildings. And that's the kind of thing we did something because we had to do something. But truly, what did we achieve? That's the question.
And I do want to pull up this video. You were talking about video, pictures, that will come out. This is video that was released a short time that shows one of those B-1 bombers you're looking at there. Now, Iran's president sent a threat to the U.S. Friday saying that, quote, it will not start a war, but if a cruel force wants to bully us, the Islamic Republic of Iran will give a strong response. What do you make of that statement? I feel like you and I have been on here multiple times and we have talked about threats from Iran. What do you make of that latest statement there?
Well, number one, I'm not surprised by it. I believe after last Sunday's attack that killed 3 U.S. service members, I think after that, Iran had to set the stage to try to publicly threaten the United States because actually they haven't felt any cost. Iran has felt no cost. So putting that out there, again, not unexpected. I think they're just trying to set the stage for possible retaliation. And I fully expect retaliation. I mean, you're going to have to do that if you're Iran to show strength to their populace, to the Ayatollahs, and to the Shia militias out there. So working through that, I think it's kind of balancing out what was expected to happen from the United States at this time. I do think they'll do something, but they would have done something anyway, Josh, without that statement or not. And they've made those statements since 1979. So this is not out of character for the Iranian regime.
Why is Iran not being struck here? Is that something that could potentially happen? Because again, we're talking about Iran, we're talking about Syria, but not Iran.
be tomorrow, although I do think we're going to see a counterattack from Shia militia soon. But it's going to happen. I mean, Iran has actually been in war with us since 1979. I can go back to the 1983 Beirut bombing barracks where we killed 241 service members. I can go back to when they attacked us after we invaded in 2003. Iran IOGC were in Iraq, causing the death of U.S. service members. So they have a long history of this. They haven't been deterred overall. At some point, we have to send a message and we have to impose costs against Iran itself. What is the strategy? I'm not sure this administration has one that's been clearly identified, either internally and especially externally to the American public and to those who wish us harm in the Middle East.
And we're talking about a lot of statements here, so let's talk about one from Hezbollah. They said that, quote, they're announcing the suspension of military and security operations against the occupation forces in order to prevent embarrassment to the Iraqi government. What is the significance of that statement overall? What are they trying to say?
Well, I think that goes back to what Iran said about retaliation should anyone strike their interests and their targets. And by the way, technically, we did strike their interests and their targets by getting some IRGC facilities in Iraq and Syria. So we'll see how that plays out. But as for Hezbollah, I think they were trying to, well, I know that they were trying to manage the messaging. After conducting the strikes, they then came out and said, we're not going to do this anymore. So what it's trying to do is create that international messaging, if you will, that says we can now retaliate against the United States because they attacked us after we said we were going to stop. Now let's not forget that there's been 100 attacks already against the U.S. forces there. Not just history deaths, but we lost a civilian contractor in Syria. Iranian attacks. And then finally, we've lost 2 SEALs. So when I look at this, I think that Team Hezbollah messaging was merely to try to bring to the court of public opinion out there and give them some pseudo-justification, if you will, for continuing attacks against us because now we're perceived as the aggressor.
Thank you.
Tetragrammaton is an online collection of curated material sourced from intuition and intellect, ranging from spiritual to physical and emotional to informative. Is it a library or a gallery? A museum? An oracle? We hope to find out. When we share the way we see the world in ways others haven't noticed or considered, that's the work of the artist. That's what an artist does. We hope to find something we didn't know we wanted to see. That feeling of discovery and counterculture. Perhaps the collaboration will inspire others to experiment and create something new. Tetragrammaton is coming into existence for our curiosity and pleasure. And if we're lucky, maybe someone else will enjoy the experience as well.
should we expect to see more strikes soon? You kind of already touched on this, but is that something that we do expect we are going to see maybe in the coming hours, days, weeks? How long until we see another strike? Because it does sound like President Biden has said, we're not done yet.
Well, and they have. We're not done yet. They've used the phrase campaign. This is a series of strikes. So a campaign lasts for days or weeks, and it starts to spread that out. Now, if the administration did its job, if it followed the military advisors, and they focused on things, we should see another round of strikes today, or this evening, overnight in Iraq and Syria. So we should see another round of strikes as soon as today to go after. Now, the process is actually taking place now, and it started last night, is the intelligence community is going through and they're looking and analyzing each one of those target areas that were attacked last night. And they'll determine what we call BDA, battle damage. And through that analysis, and whatever their objectives that they were told, destroy this building, destroy this command and control center, they will give an evaluation that we achieved success or we did not achieve success. And where we did not, we should restrike those targets. So we have to ensure that we met the objectives on those targets. Then we should have a second set of targets ready to go, and we should strike those. It should be to maintain the pressure that they should start tonight, and we should start to see more assets into the position. And perhaps in addition to just man fighter aircraft, we should see some cruise and missile attacks also coming from our naval assets. So that's what we should be seeing. This should be a sustained campaign if the true intent and true objective is to go out there and destroy some of these things. But I don't know. Are we destroying or are we deterring? That's the big question.
And I want to talk a little bit more about the conflict in the Middle East between Israel, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of different topics that you and I have discussed over the past, I would say, several weeks and really several months at this point. Hamas has yet to respond to the latest ceasefire deal that would allegedly release all of those hostages that do remain that were taken on October 7th. What might be the holdup there?
Well, I think you got a couple of critical things. This actually started a couple of weeks ago, and it was a complicated six-phase peace proposal that was worked between Qatar, Egypt, Israel, Hamas, and the United States. So all those parties are talking behind closed doors. That one about 2 weeks ago completely fell apart. It's just too complicated. So you're into about three phases right now of this current agreement and arrangement that we're looking at. So when I look at this, the key components are the release of the hostages, as you talked about. But there's a critical sticking point, and that's where Israel and Hamas are diametrically opposed. One of those is Hamas says we want full withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza. Israel says they don't want to do that. So we're talking about what's on the table is a 6-week pause or cessation of hostilities. And then once that begins, we start releasing the hostages. But the key sticking point, as I said, is will Israel withdraw from Gaza? That would be a military disaster. All the gains that they have made in the last several months to try to push Hamas back, and you still have at least half or a little bit more of Hamas fighting capability in existence. That would make Israel lose all of those military gains and set its objectives back, while allowing Hamas the opportunity to refit, rearm, and resupply, which is what they want. So how Hamas responds to this, not getting their way, and Israel, in my opinion, needs to stay strong and not lose its military gains. I think that's where you're going to see things start to break down. If they're going to break down, it's right there in key form of withdrawal versus non-withdrawal.
A lot of great information there. My last question for you is going to be about the Houthis. I know this is kind of a loaded question and a hard question to answer, but what is the latest with that situation there involving the Houthis?
You know, if we go back a few weeks, Josh, when we started, we saw the U.S.-UK attacks. They've done 2 rounds of those. You see the U.S. conducted limited pinpoint strikes against uploaded missiles or other facilities right there. And just the other day, the Houthis were preparing to launch a surface-to-air missile against U.S. aircraft. We took that out. This hasn't stopped the Houthis. They continue to load up missiles. They continue to fire.
Get him!
They try to attack shipping out there. They've gone directly against U.S. naval vessels operating in the area. So our deterrence effect and our degradation, while minimal on degradation, we still haven't deterred the Houthis from conducting these attacks. We have seen the negative impact on shipping throughout the European area and even the United States. You've got shipping companies that won't go through there. So we don't have a safe passage area through the Bab el-Mandeb or the Red Sea at this time. And the Houthis have not been destroyed. Their capabilities have not been destroyed. So they're going to strike back. Matter of fact, I would expect an uptick in Houthi strikes and to show solidarity with their Iranian-backed Shia militia who were attacked last night. So I'm going to see this kind of balance out and some public messaging start to take place, considering they all are mainly controlled and supported by Iran.
All right, Mark Chandler there with Coastal Carolina University. As always, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us and break down all the latest details. There's a lot to it. We appreciate you being here with us pretty much on a weekly basis. Anything else you want to add about any of this before I let you go?
Well, Josh, I want to go back a little bit to that Iranian statement, the Iranian threat, and some of the words that I hear the administration talking about, not seeking escalation, not wanting a war in the Middle East. You know, I don't know what our strategy is. It's hard to determine that, as I said. But there is already war with Iran. But it's from an Iranian perspective. And what's happened here, and what's critical to understand is the United States does not control the tempo of this campaign. The tempo and the escalation ladder, if you will, is controlled by Iran. They have been attacking us, and I gave those examples for decades of what they've done. The 160-something attacks now are controlled by Iran. We didn't need to suffer those 3 deaths last week. We could have stopped these attacks against U.S. forces about 140 attacks ago had we sent a strong deterrence message at that time. Iran does not want to fight the U.S. in a one-for-one war. The cost would be extreme. It would be, regime would falter, perhaps collapse. And so you have to look at that and realize that it's time for the U.S. to use strength and not worry about escalation. We have to control the tempo here. I am not advocating war in any sense of the imagination, but I am advocating strength through deterrence if we need to do that. Because, as I said, we don't control the tempo at this time. Iran is kind of calling the shots on how this plays out, even though we had big public success last night, and that's how it's going to play out. I'm not trying to be a cynic. I'm just trying to be a realist here.
And I guess it's not even a question to ask who has the stronger military, the U.S. or Iran and its proxies there. I think the answer is probably the U.S., right?
Correct. We have the strongest. We just need to utilize it.
All right. Mark, thank you again for taking the time to be here with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Josh. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss this with you. Of course.
It's the most advanced stealth fighter ever developed, capable of defeating any radar ever invented, and it can kill 10 American F-22 Raptors with just one missile, at least if you listen to the Russian Ministry of Defense. But why is an aircraft the Russians claim is more advanced than the American F-22 and F-35 conspicuously absent over the skies of Ukraine, exactly where it's needed the most by Russian forces? The Su-57 is a Russian multi-role fighter that's Russia's first attempt at a fifth-generation aircraft. It was conceived in 1999 after its predecessor, the Mikoil Project 144, proved to be entirely too expensive to actually put into production. The Project 144 was meant to be an answer to America's own F-22, which was at the time nearing completion and initial operational capability. However, the collapse of the Soviet Union led to an economic crisis, and the project struggled to find adequate funding. The MiG-144 would have its maiden flight in February 2000, and then be canceled shortly after. The Su-57, NATO codenamed Felon, was meant to build upon the successes of the 144 and field a true fifth-generation fighter. By now, the United States was starting to churn out the F-22 Raptor, and Russia had no answer to this critical threat. But almost inevitably, the Felon ran into its own financial difficulties, and a program that was meant to produce a fleet of fighters by the mid-2000s would only deliver its first operational aircraft in 2020. Russia couldn't afford to produce the Su-57 on its own, though, and troubles began early when Russia and India signed an agreement to co-develop the aircraft in September 2010. As the project evolved, however, Indian engineers voiced serious concerns about the aircraft's capabilities and survivability against American fifth-generation fighters. By 2014, India had lost faith in the Su-57 and formally abandoned the program, leaving Russia to finance it on its own. This immediately putting massive financial strain on Russia, further compounded by sanctions of high-technology goods from the West after its annexation of Crimea. The Su-57 struggled through development, and a fleet once envisioned to consist of over 100 aircraft ended up producing only a dozen or so test models. In 2018, Russia claimed that the Su-57 took part in combat operations in Syria. However, there's no real proof that the jet performed any combat duties in the country. It's very likely then that Russia merely deployed the plane there to fly non-combat sorties so as to attempt to rouse interest from foreign investors, a very common tactic by the Russian defense industry. With a poorly diversified economy under pressure from sanctions, Russia relies heavily on foreign buyers to fund its weapons development programs. Despite no verifiable proof of the combat record, Russia claims that it partook in combat operations both in Syria and in Ukraine, where Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu claimed that Su-57s took part in operations to neutralize Ukrainian air defenses and eliminated multiple Ukrainian surface-to-air missile batteries. Since we've all learned that Russia literally never flies, ever, this is an impressive feat for an airplane that's technically still in development. What's more impressive about this plane, however, is the fact that the Su-57 is not even believed by Western observers to be a true stealth aircraft, merely one with stealth characteristics. Observers point to difficulties by the Russians in joining the panels of the body together tightly enough to reduce radar return, as well as its glaringly non-stealthy engines. The body of the aircraft is also significantly less stealthy than American counterparts, giving out far larger radar returns from the sides and rear. This, however, is in line with the Russian philosophy of operating aircraft while limit the safety of ground-based air defenses. The Russians simply couldn't afford to field in all aspects stealth aircraft and thus focused only on frontal stealth. The aircraft also appears to lack another quality of a fifth-generation fighter, data link capabilities. While tests are underway to have the Su-57 speak with a drone, this is far from the capabilities of the US F-35, which can operate as a sort of mini air control platform in place of traditional AWACS, speaking with a variety of friendly aircraft, helping guide weapons and planes to their targets. However, the Su-57 does have some design advantages over real fifth-generation aircraft in America's arsenal. For one, it's far more maneuverable than any US aircraft, and this is a big clue to the fact that the Russians know this is not inferior to an American fifth-generation fighter. That's because super maneuverability is not a design feature of a traditional fifth-gen aircraft, which are designed to operate as assassins, not night fighters. F-35s and F-22s are built to engage enemy targets from beyond visual range with advanced AIM-120B missiles that have ranges in excess of 90 miles. Not only is this missile range outside the range of most other enemy missiles, but the stealth characteristics of F-22 or F-35 means that an enemy being fired on won't even be able to detect a stealth fighter until it's much, much closer, estimated at about 3 dozen or so miles. With limited internal payloads of 6 to 8 missiles, stealth aircraft should never be involved in a dogfight. Thus, super maneuverability is only desired if you have reason to believe your aircraft will be forced into dogfights because it's not stealthy enough or has the targeting capabilities to engage in a long-range fight. So while the Su-57 is capable of some truly impressive acrobatic feats, this will be meaningless in over 90% of engagements against adversaries such as the U.S. Air Force. Further giving proofs to the fact that the Su-57 is not a true stealth aircraft are its cheek-mounted radars, which allow it to guide missiles to target at far more extreme angles than its American counterparts. This allows the Su-57 to turn further away from its target than an American plane and still maintain a good radar lock. But you only build this capability if you expect your aircraft to have to fight at close ranges where extreme maneuvers are required, or if you expect your aircraft to have to dodge or defend against enemy missiles while guiding its own to the target. It's likely the Russian knew from the start that Velen would be detectable at far greater range than U.S. aircraft and would need the ability to maneuver away from incoming missiles while maintaining a lock for its own. Despite this, the Russian Ministry of Defense claims the Su-57 is not just a match, but superior to the F-22 and F-35. If that's the case, then where is Russia's premier aircraft when its army needs it the most? In the skies over Ukraine. First, if all claims about the Su-57 are true, Russia simply wouldn't be able to field them in large enough numbers to make much of a difference. Currently, there are only about a dozen or so Su-57s in operation, and most of these are test aircraft, not meant for combat duty. this likely only leaves just over half a dozen that carry weapons to target successfully. But there's no evidence outside of Russian planes that this is actually happening. Best the world can manage is a video of an aircraft with a similar shape to the Su-57 captured on video early in the war carrying out an air-to-ground attack. Most experts agree that if the Su-57 is truly engaged in combat with Ukraine, then it's not seeing frontline duty. Rather, the plane is likely only firing standoff attack munitions at long ranges from the safety of Russian airspace. Armed with the right weapons, the Su-57 could potentially stay out of range of Ukrainian air defenses and destroy them, as claimed by Russia. But there's practically no chance that Russia is willing to risk flying its flagship aircraft over the front lines, where it could potentially be shot down, causing Russia heaps of international embarrassment, at least more than it's earned so far. This is doubly true when you consider that Russia also fears Western weapons employed by Ukraine, and knows for a fact that Western nations are feeding a steady diet of intelligence to Ukraine's armed forces. So why is the Su-57 not in operation over Ukraine? First, there's simply not enough of them to be worth employing. Russia has goals of just under 100 of the fighter by 2027, something that is completely unrealistic given extreme Western sanctions against the nation. If your military is having to strip washers and microwaves for microchips, you're not going to be fielding 100 stealth fighters in 5 years. Secondly, the plane was almost certainly not nearly as capable as Russia claims it to be. And the last thing Russia wants is the embarrassment of having one shot down by Ukraine. Russia has lost an estimated 144 aircraft in the war, with 24 of those being frontline manned fighters or ground attack aircraft. The threat environment is too high for Russia to risk the PR disaster that would ensure if a felon was shot down by the Ukrainians. On February 24th, 2022, Vladimir Putin launched an invasion of Ukraine. His first attacks were west of the separatist region of Donetsk and Luhansk, quickly followed by a thrust south from Belarus toward Kiev. Russia's much-vaunted paratroopers and air assault forces attempted several landings outside of Kiev, but were repelled and failed in their mission. The plan was to quickly take Kiev by flying reinforcements directly into major airfields outside of the city, and it was a Over the next month, troops pushed north out of Russian-occupied Crimea in an attempt to link up with assaults out of Luhansk and Donetsk. An amphibious invasion of Odessa was greatly feared, but Ukrainian resistance was much stiffer than expected, and the invasion was cancelled. In the north of the country, the Kiev incursion was met with fierce resistance and soon ran into serious logistics problems. Inevitably, Russian forces were forced to flee back to Belarus, having failed to take Ukraine's capital. Similar incursions along the northern border east of Kiev were also repulsed. Russia moved its defeated troops from the Kiev assault to the east, where the war was faring better for them. Now, though, Russian forces have reached a sort of stalemate, and the conflict is largely frozen with only minor advancements by either side. Russia, however, has continued to suffer catastrophic defeats, including the near-total defeat of an entire battalion tactical group outside of Bilohorivka, thanks to a well-planned Ukrainian ambush. Kherson, which has been firmly in Russian hands for weeks, is soon to be in dispute with Ukrainian forces making serious pushes toward the city. What Ukraine does when the war is over depends on how the next few months of the war play out. There are two probable scenarios for Ukraine's future and one nightmare scenario that's more frighteningly real than you might realize. But before we look at those scenarios, I have an important question for you. Do you begin every morning by lying in bed and endlessly scrolling through social media looking for news? Maybe you get little snippets of random stories, most of which have literally no relevance to you. If you're like me, then it leaves you feeling unfulfilled, uninformed, and overall it's a terrible way to start off your day. I need to change my routine, which is why I'm so happy I found out about the sponsor of today's video, Morning Brew. Morning Brew is a free newsletter that gets you up to speed on the topics that matter to you in a witty, fun, informative way in just 5 minutes, like why airports have been such a mess lately, why oil prices have been rapidly changing, or that there's a 76-million-year-old dinosaur skeleton about to go up for auction. Of course, it's likely to sell for at least $5 million, so I'll probably be sitting that one out. But unlike the fossilized Gorgosaurus, signing up for Morning Brew is completely free and it takes less than 15 seconds. So whether you're interested in business, finance, or tech, you can become smarter in 5 minutes every day by signing up for Morning Brew at morningbrewdaily.com/infographics, or click that link in the description. In the first scenario, Russian forces successfully recouped their losses and pressed their great numbers advantage by flooding the nation with an additional 24 battalion tactical groups and perhaps enacting general mobilization. Russia began to put serious pressure on Ukraine's military. Inevitably, the massive Russian war machine slowly but painfully crushes all resistance before it. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has now two choices. First, he can surrender when it becomes clear that further resistance is futile. This will inevitably come at the cost of his own presidency, as the Kremlin will not accept any surrender from Ukraine that doesn't involve the removal of Zelensky as a precondition. This scenario is unlikely, as it would require Russia to generate a significant amount of momentum that it's been unable to generate yet. Only if Russian forces are making advances of several miles or more a day would continued resistance seem futile to Ukrainian defenders. Zelensky would thus see further resistance as simply a waste of his military's lives. But luckily for Ukraine, this seems completely impossible. For starters, Ukraine has a lot of territory to trade for time. This should be a strategy familiar to the Russians, as it's exactly what they did in the war against Germany, trading miles upon miles of territory in exchange for the time to build up proper defenses. Russia, however, is even more vulnerable to a territory for time strategy than Germany was, as their logistics were already terrible to begin with, and only worsened with the destruction of hundreds of cargo and transport trucks by the Ukrainian and foreign volunteers fighting with them. Drawing Russian forces deep into Ukrainian territory will result in overstretched supply lines and open up opportunities elsewhere for Ukraine to counterattack. Russian losses are severe after only 3 months of fighting, with an estimated 25% of all combat personnel from the initial invasion force now either killed or too wounded to continue fighting. Tank and armored vehicle losses for Russia are so heavy, it's estimated it'll take 2 years to replenish them at this point. And the losses continue to mount. In short, Russia cannot realistically generate the momentum necessary for forcing an early surrender by Zelensky, and pumping thousands of freshly mobilized conscripts into the conflict will in all likelihood only hurt the Russian cause rather than help it. So, we're rating an early surrender by Zelensky a very low probability as of May 11th, 2022. President Zelensky's second choice is to fight Russia to a slowly losing standstill. What we mean by this is that the front lines will remain largely frozen, but with tiny incremental gains by Russian forces over time. As a matter of fact, that seems to be the nature of the conflict right now, with Russia being hammered badly and winning only small gains. So the Ukrainians themselves have managed their own small gains. So we're not quite at this scenario yet. However, inevitably it might become clear that Russia simply cannot be defeated by Ukraine, and Zelensky's second choice is to negotiate a peace with special conditions with Russia. This will likely mean that Ukraine gives up much of its territory in the Donbas region, which is largely under Russian control today, and gives up its strategic seaports along the Sea of Azov. Crimea remain in Russian hands, and the Sea of Azov now becomes a Russian lake fully under its control. Initially, Vladimir Putin claimed that he had no intention of occupying Ukraine. However, not only is Putin proven to be a liar, but Russian forces have been well documented doing everything they can to quickly Russify occupied territories. They've replaced Ukrainian streets and building signs with their Russian counterparts, instituted provisional governments, ensured the pensions of elderly Ukrainians, and introduced the Russian ruble as the official currency. All this has been done to purposefully entrench Russian culture inside of Ukraine itself, in preparation for their full adoption into the Russian fold. Currently, Ukraine is likely unable to fully eject Russian forces from its territory, which means that this is the most likely scenario. While Ukraine is being armed and supplied by the West, it's not being given the heavy equipment necessary for a large offensive operation against Russian forces. However, if the conflict continues to rage for a year or more, this might change, as it takes months to train Ukrainian crews to operate Western tanks or aircraft, and also set up the supply chains and logistics hubs needed to operate them inside Ukraine. Even then, arming Ukraine at a large scale with Western heavy equipment is incredibly unlikely unless this war drags on for years and becomes another decade-long debacle for Russia, much like Afghanistan was to the Soviet Union and then later to the U.S. It's unlikely then that Ukraine will be able to successfully repel Russia's invasion and push them back to their own borders, though Ukraine could instead make the conflict so painful for Russia that it agrees to a settled peace, with the currently occupied territories part of the cost of continued Ukrainian independence. In this case, without being able to threaten Kyiv, it's highly unlikely that Russia also presses for the removal of President Zelensky, and Ukraine will be able to remain largely free to dictate its own course. It is, however, very likely that peace in either of these two scenarios comes with the condition that Ukraine remain committed to absolute neutrality and repeals its constitutional amendment which enshrines NATO membership directly into the constitution of the country. Depending on how bad the war is for Ukraine in the long run, additional concessions might have to be given, including the establishment of some form of veto power by Russia over internal Ukrainian matters. In essence, a return to the era of the Soviet Union. The second possible scenario for Ukraine is a total military defeat of Russia and the expulsion of Russian invading forces back to the breakaway regions of Luhansk and Donetsk. Given what we've just discussed, this seems like the far least likely of the two scenarios. But but certain key facts could dramatically alter the course of war. The first and likely most important fact is that Russia is taking completely unsustainable losses in the conflict. At a current rate of personnel and equipment loss, Russia will have lost the equivalent of its entire invasion force within 6 more months, an absolute military catastrophe for Russia, which would take decades to recover from. These losses are having a dramatic follow-on effect, though, as reports from all across the front paint a picture of severely demoralized Russian troops. Demoralized troops are a massive liability in war. The fact that Russia is facing such a significant morale problem that is fed by near daily large-scale losses puts the fighting ability of the Russian military in serious jeopardy. Those losses are inevitably being filled with more and more conscripts as the pool of professional volunteers runs low, and conscripts bring even further weak morale to units already suffering from a borderline morale crisis. But if Russia's only problem was morale, it would count itself lucky, because a big reason for the low morale and high casualties is Russia's sheer ineptitude. The Russian military was greatly feared prior to the conflict, with news agencies around the world commenting on the massive modernization effort Russia undertook over the last 2 decades. To show off its capabilities, Russia put on annual military exercises involving tens of thousands of troops, all meant to showcase Russian firepower to NATO observers, and the conclusions were grim. Russia had become extremely adept at combined arms maneuvers, and was a modern military to be feared. Day 1 of the invasion completely changed all of that. And since then, the Russian military has exposed that it's always been a paper tiger. Troops routinely show little discipline and even less training, as they scatter and panic during ambushes instead of fighting back or conducting flank assaults to relieve pressure on the ambush kill zone. Air defense batteries are destroyed on the ground by Ukrainian jets and drones because their operators never bothered to turn their air defense radars on. The Russian military is so inept that Ukraine even managed to strike deep inside Russia with its own attack helicopters, completely to the surprise of any air defense radar operators. It's not just that Russian troops are poorly trained, it's that Russia is simply bad at war. These exercises, which showed off their great combined arms skills, were clearly highly scripted, because inside of Ukraine, under actual enemy fire, Russia has yet to conduct a satisfactory combined arms operation. In the realm of battlefield logistics, Russia has proven itself to be worse than a novice, as fundamentally its battalion tactical groups simply don't have enough trucks for proper resupply. Russian weapon stockpiles have also run dangerously low of precision munitions, to the point that by the start of May, we're seeing heavy use of unguided bombs in attacks that once used precision munitions. It's now believed that Russia's remaining reserves are a fraction of their original size, and dedicated to supporting potential contingency operations in case of war against NATO. That means they can't be used in Ukraine, or else Russia faces being completely unprepared to fight NATO armies. There are even reports that Russia is resorting to the use of mothball 1960s missiles for long-range strikes, with weapons that are potentially as dangerous to the Russians launching them as they are to whoever's on the other end of poorly guided munitions. The tail of the tape adds up to this. Russia is entering a serious crisis that could blossom into full-blown catastrophe if the situation on the ground doesn't change dramatically. Unlike Western nations, Russia can't rebuild its precision weapon stockpiles because of global sanctions, as the electronic components it relies on are built in places like Taiwan. This leaves it with only one choice: return to fighting a 20th century conflict much like during the World War II era, with comparable equipment. Yet, while Ukraine is suffering its own heavy losses, it's being steadily resupplied by the West. If resupply of heavy equipment continues, and possibly even transfer of Western hardware like the M1 Abrams tank, in 6 months, Russia could find itself trying to throw 20th century weapons at 21st century Ukrainian threats. It's not completely inconceivable that the problems of bad morale, terrible training and doctrine, and a lack of modern equipment leads the Russians to be overwhelmed by Ukrainian forces equipped with superior Western technologies. A morale crisis similar to the 1917 crisis that resulted in Russia leaving the First World War could prompt a wide-scale defeat of Russia inside Ukraine, and with it a catastrophic political upheaval for Putin that will likely end up with him in prison or more likely dead. But it's exactly the flooding of Ukraine with Western arms that could lead to our third nightmare scenario, and one that's more probable than you think. If Russia begins to suffer serious defeats, or if Ukraine begins to receive large shipments of heavy Western equipment, it might leave Putin with only one choice: the use of weapons of mass destruction. Already, Russia has laid down the groundwork for justifying the use of chemical weapons, as it's used its state propaganda arm to spew a steady stream of lies claiming that Ukrainians have several bio and chemical weapon labs in the country being funded by the United States. Some Russian state news outlets even claim that Ukrainian forces or mercenaries hired by the U.S. have already carried out small-scale chemical attacks. This is merely the beginning of a false flag attack staged by Russia to justify the use of weapons against the stubborn Ukrainian defenders that so far it's failed to dislodge with conventional means. Russia has little to fear from using these weapons too, as Ukraine is unable to respond in kind, as it has no WMDs of its own. We could see widespread chemical attacks across the Eastern Front, followed by massive assaults against severely weakened Ukrainian forces. However, American President Joe Biden has warned that this is a line in the sand for him, and that if Russia were to use WMDs inside Ukraine, the United States would respond appropriately. The interpretation of this response has been purposefully left vague, but it could mean everything from American strikes using chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons against Russian forces inside Ukraine to directly supplying Ukraine with its own chemical or biological weapons. Either move would turn Ukraine into a hellscape reminiscent of 1916 Central Europe, only at a far greater magnitude due to the increased lethality of modern chemical and biological weapons. Should Putin step across that line to the use of nuclear weapons, Ukraine might find large swaths of territory irradiated after only even a limited exchange of nuclear weapons. This naturally carries with it the risk of escalation, as Russia and NATO turn their nuclear weapons on each other instead, causing what might be the final conflict in history. Whatever path the future takes, it's certain that it will take years, if not decades, for a commonplace war. Many cities are partially or largely destroyed after indiscriminate weapons barrages purposefully targeting civilians, and this will take incredible effort and resources to rebuild. Yet, Europe rebuilt from the World War, and the United States is using Ukraine for the long term. We'll likely see a 21st century Marshall Plan after the liberation of Ukraine, financed in large part by the U.S., and in time the nation will heal. However, in what fashion Ukraine survives as a state, free or Soviet-style client, remains to be seen, as does just how much territory it'll get to keep intact. As of the making of this video on September 13th, 2022, Ukrainian armed forces have delivered Russia its greatest tactical defeat since it failed to take Kyiv at the start of the war. Many in the West are calling Ukraine's recent counteroffensive game-changing. Even Russian propagandists have expressed great alarm and concern over the success of the offensive, going as far as to admit Russian forces were forced to retreat from the Kharkiv region. But how in the world was this counteroffensive so successful? Does this risk the use of nuclear weapons by a desperate Russia? Ukraine's counteroffensive began on September 6th, but it had been gestating for weeks before. To much fanfare, Ukraine announced a significant buildup of forces in the south, aimed at retaking Kherson. The city is a strategically important hub in the south of Ukraine that would allow Ukrainian forces to push even deeper into the south and even attack Crimea with long-range munitions. With an attack on the Saki air base in Crimea in early August that left many Russian planes destroyed or damaged, an attack on Kherson seemed like a serious threat. The buildup of Ukrainian forces prompted Russia to redeploy 10 battalion tactical groups to the south to reinforce the region. It's still too early and details remain classified, but it's beginning to look as if the attack on Kherson had the goal of overextending the Russian line over the Dnieper River, or perhaps Ukraine simply exploited weakened Russian positions in the north. What's for sure is that while the attack on Kherson has made some modest progress, Russia has absolutely been routed around Kharkiv, with full-scale retreat by the Russians so chaotic and panicked that tens of millions of dollars of equipment and ammunition were simply left behind. The key to Ukraine's success begins with one weapon system, the high-mobility artillery rocket system, developed and fielded by the United States and provided to Ukraine in small quantities at the start of the summer. Wary of committing large amounts of sophisticated equipment that might end up destroyed or captured by superior Russian firepower, the dozen or so HIMARS units initially supplied were put to immediate and cleverly devastating use by the Ukrainians. HIMARS combines far superior range over traditional artillery with precision, allowing Ukrainian forces to hit Russia where it hurt most, with a range of about 57 miles. Using standard rockets, or 190 miles, using the Army Tactical Missile System, HIMARS enabled Ukraine to reach out to enemy rear areas and devastate command posts and supply hubs. Russia's senior officers, who were already an endangered species on the Ukrainian battlefield, were now being assassinated from dozens of miles away. This forced the relocation of command posts 100 or more miles away from the front lines. This simple move was devastating to an army with a heavy top-down command structure. Russian forces lack a strong non-commissioned officer corps, thanks to their heavy reliance on conscripts and difficulty keeping professional soldiers interested in re-enlistment. This means that the senior officers often have to be on or near the front lines to ensure their orders are carried out. But now it was suddenly very dangerous for them to be anywhere near the front, forcing them back and giving them less operational control over the units. But we'll get more into that when we discuss the reason Ukrainian units are more successful than Russian units. It wasn't just command posts that had to be moved, but ammunition and fuel depots as well. With several weeks of shaping operations, Ukraine set the stage for the counteroffensive. Russia, showing incredible ineptitude, largely stood by and allowed these shaping operations to continue nearly unchallenged. The end result was catastrophic, as Ukraine destroyed huge amounts of logistical supplies and forced Russia to move its supply hubs far from the front. This had the direct effect of limiting the maneuverability of Russian units, who now had to wait twice or even 3 times as long for resupply as they normally would. Being forced to sit on your hands is a good way to lose in a modern war, as Russia quickly found out. Another American weapon that Ukraine put to excellent use in shaping the battlefield before its counteroffensive was the HARM missile, or high-speed anti-radiation missile, provided Ukraine in classified numbers. An effort by American and Ukrainian engineers resulted in the adaptation of Western-style mounts for the HARM for Ukraine's Soviet-made planes. Once equipped with HARMs, Ukraine's Air Force began to target Russian radars to devastating effect. The loss of air defense and counter-battery radars made it increasingly difficult for Russia to defend against air attack or retaliate against Ukrainian artillery with its own barrages. This ended up being a major game changer on the battlefield, bringing a level of parity between the two powers. The loss of confidence in detecting and shooting down Ukrainian fighters is likely part of the reason why the attack in the north was such a surprise. Russian recon aircraft and drones were apparently not being used in large amounts, likely due to fear of being shot down. The next reason for Ukraine's wildly successful counteroffensive is its fundamental military strength over Russia. Russia is by far the more powerful military, but it's also by far the least capable, a fact Ukraine has exploited to great advantage. Back in 2014, when Russia rolled into Crimea, the Ukrainian military was at a crisis point. It was poorly trained and poorly equipped, trying to fight off Russian forces by using the same Soviet doctrine that Russia itself used. However, shortly after the Crimean invasion, the United States and other NATO partners entered Ukraine and began a comprehensive training and restructuring program for its military. Hundreds of Americans would make the trip to Ukraine over the next 8 years, training Ukraine in Western doctrine and tactics and completely reshaping its military. The result is not perfect, but Ukraine's armed forces today more closely resemble a professional Western force than they did in 2014. Ukrainian junior officers and commanders are encouraged to seize the initiative and make their own decisions in the midst of combat, a characteristic lacked by the Russian side. This allows Ukrainian units to be far more adaptable and maneuverable than their Russian counterparts, who must sit and wait for orders from their higher-ups before doing anything not already discussed in contingency planning. As Ukrainian forces began to discover vulnerabilities in Russian defenses in the north, this freedom of initiative would come to play in significant ways as Ukrainian commanders ordered their units to further exploit defensive gaps. Unable to adjust their defenses as the combat environment evolved around them, Russian units were forced to simply flee, though a significant number would simply surrender. The penetration of Russian lines allowed Ukrainian armor and mechanized infantry to then sweep into the rear areas and wreak havoc amongst the lightly defended support units there, such as the artillery and support units. This only aggravated the growing panic from the Russians, prompting even further unauthorized retreats. Once gaps were exploited in the Russian lines, the fundamental structure of the Russian military worked directly against it. Russia is fundamentally an artillery army. It knows it's technologically and professionally outclassed by Western counterparts, and has thus sought to achieve some level of parity with the West by fielding significant artillery forces, outnumbering even the United States in tube and rocket artillery. Yet, this over-reliance on artillery means that once their front line has been compromised, there's little that Russian support can do. Artillery is slow, even self-propelled guns, and poorly suited to defend against a fast-moving mechanized offensive without infantry in the way to slow it down. Once Ukrainian forces were through Russian lines, artillery crews had no choice but to flee, often leaving their equipment behind. Another key difference between Russian and Ukrainian forces is not just training or doctrine, but simple esprit de corps. Russian forces have long known to be increasingly demoralized by the grinding war in Ukraine. For starters, none of them saw the Ukrainians as enemies before the war, but rather as a brother nation. Then, when the war began, they were promised a swift victory and that they'd be met with hugs and flowers by the locals. Instead, the offensive to take Kyiv failed, while Russian troops in the east were met with Molotov cocktails. Their deployment of modern Western weapons in Ukraine took an even greater toll on the Russian morale, as American HIMARS and Excalibur-guided artillery shells wreaked precision havoc amongst Russian forces. Compounding Russian logistics problems led to some units running completely out of food and being forced to steal or scavenge from locals, creating even more morale problems for the Russian military. By comparison, Ukraine's forces are highly motivated both by their desire to defend the homeland, but also by a sense of vengeance over Russian atrocities across occupied territories. Putin, now known as the Butcher of Bucha, waged a campaign of unrestricted warfare against Ukrainian civilians, and his military has used murder and worse as tools meant to weaken Ukrainian morale and their will to fight. However, these tactics have backfired and given Ukraine's defenders an even greater desire to throw Russian forces out of their country. President Zelensky's refusal to leave the capital when it seemed as if it would fall any day made him an instant hero in the eyes of the people and gave the nation a critically needed morale boost. The Russians don't now know why they're fighting. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, know exactly what's at stake if they don't. Ukrainian troops are not just better trained and increasingly better equipped, but far more motivated to fight than the Russians. While the exact number is unknown yet, given the secrecy of the ongoing operation, it's estimated that as many as 3,000 Russians may have surrendered to the Ukrainians. What is known is that Ukrainian authorities have said that they have recently captured so many POWs that they're running out of room to house them. The final reasons for Ukraine's success comes down to Russia itself. Despite formally being considered the world's second most powerful nation, Russia has proven that it is completely unprepared to face a modern foe. In the face of modern Western weapons and doctrine, Russian forces have faltered or stumbled directly into disaster. They seem to show no recognition of the power of long-range precision munitions, perhaps best explained by the fact that Russia itself has traditionally fielded few smart weapons relying heavily on dumb, unguided munitions. Staggering disregard for electronic and signals intelligence has allowed the U.S. and other NATO nations to track down and pinpoint Russian VIPs, passing the information along to Ukrainian frontline units armed with precision Excalibur artillery rounds or other smart weapons. The U.S. has not commented much on the intelligence shared with Ukraine, but many suspect that the Americans are giving Ukraine pretty much every drop of intelligence that they've gathered. With drones flying just outside the conflict area, satellites, human sources, and electronic eavesdropping measures, the U.S. intelligence apparatus has been able to provide Ukraine with mountains of intelligence and made surprise military operations by Russia all but impossible. The Ukrainians have also been able to tap into a wealth of intelligence provided by partisans behind enemy lines, as well as fully exploiting Russian foolishness. Multiple times now, Russian TV crews have filmed near-sensitive military equipment or personnel, leading to an immediate and devastating response by Ukrainian forces. In one particularly noteworthy incident in August, a Russian reporter posted a photo of a Wagner Group mercenary outside their barracks in occupied Ukraine. The photo included the street address of the building, and Ukraine used HIMARS launchers to level it, leading to the death of up to 100 Wagner mercenaries. As the war continues to rage on, some or even all of Ukraine's gains could be reversed, though that's very unlikely. Russian forces are increasingly exhausted, demoralized, and rebellious, and it's rumored that Russia is suspending the sending of new units to Ukraine. This could make an increasingly desperate Putin resort to extreme measures, such as the use of chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons, facing growing opposition at home as multiple municipalities, including St. Petersburg and 2 Moscow districts, call for his resignation. Putin almost certainly views a general retreat from Ukraine as wholly unacceptable, which may make the next phase of the war even more, not less dangerous than before. However, that's no reason for Western support for Ukraine to falter right now when it matters most. With fighting set to die down during the difficult winter season, this is the time for the West to prepare Ukraine for even greater counteroffensives come springtime, this time equipped with large numbers of Western vehicles and weapons. It's the beginning of October 2022. A young American man is doing something spectacularly unusual. He is actually reading a newspaper. So, what has he learned from this mysterious object of yore? Well, it's Jimmy Carter's 98th birthday. The U.S. and Venezuela just did a prisoner swap, and it's the 5-year anniversary of the deadliest mass shooting in U.S. modern history. But the story that gets his attention is headlined, Ukraine has been turned into a giant scrap heap of Russian tanks. What's going on? What's been going on? That's what we'll find out today. It's true, if you went to certain areas of Ukraine right now, you'd find what look like graveyards for Russian tanks. The tanks, usually looking like they're well past their prime, are everywhere. You can see photos of them in the background as Ukrainians go about their normal day. Take, for example, the town of Izyum, in Kharkiv Oblast province in eastern Ukraine. This place used to look majestic. These days, if you walk through parts of history, the word that would spring to mind is apocalypse. It was liberated in September 2022, but not before 5 months of fighting. When the Russians were there, they spent some of their time interrogating, torturing, and killing residents. One of them who survived later said he was interrogated and shot by one of those old Soviet military field telephones. Another witness said Russians wore masks and tortured civilians with bare electric wires. Mass graves were later dug up, with the Western media saying this was now a pattern of Russian occupation. We only know this, of course, because the Russians left in a hurry. They didn't just retreat, but they left all kinds of things behind, including quite a lot of tanks, some patched up, some just abandoned. The Washington Post wrote, Ukrainian troops have documented war machines in various states, from combat-ready tanks to vehicles in need of repair. In some cases, Ukrainian forces have obliterated Russian weapons, leaving smoldering vehicles to be discovered by the advancing forces. In one of the videos, you can actually hear a Ukrainian talking about the Russian tanks as if they were the factory of school kids stolen candy. One of the soldiers says, you and I get a tank. We all get a tank each. This is just one town. If you were to visit the town of Noman in the Donbass region, you'd see something similar. You find tanks all over the place, some of which have been damaged, but some that were abandoned in decent shape. What a gift that is to the Ukrainians. We'll come to the value of such tanks a bit later. One media report said the aftermath of the Russian retreat was a macabre scene. Bodies of Russian and Ukrainian soldiers were strewn all over the streets. A Ukrainian resident told the Ukrainian soldier, the smell is unbearable. The stray dogs have already eaten 2 of them. When are you coming to pick up these dead bodies? She might have also asked, when are you going to take all those damn tanks away? The retreat was described as embarrassing for Putin. Not only had the Russian army lost a lot of young men, but again, the Russians have lost a lot of very expensive machinery too. The Guardian wrote, video showed burned down vehicles, personal belongings, and dead soldiers strewn across a forest road. Ukrainian forces recovered at least one T-72 tank, which had suffered minor damage. Carnage everywhere. Dead people lying in the streets. Families found dead in their cars. The great big pileup of heavy-duty military weapons. You can read a news story similar to this relating to a number of places. Earlier in the year, news reports suggested that Russia was losing about 5 tanks daily. And things got much worse for Russia when Ukraine began its counteroffensive in the east later in the year. The number of tank losses was then reported to be in the region of 10 tanks a day. These were T-72s, T-80s, and T-90s. Some of the T-62s that were destroyed or captured date back to the 70s, possibly even the 60s. Sure, Ukrainians have lost a good number of their own tanks, but not anywhere near as many as the Russians. According to various sources in the Western media, the Russian media, of course, might put a different spin on things. No doubt both sides don't mind losing the numbers in that war, but these tanks are proof that Russia has done extremely badly in the tank department. 10 tanks a day adds up to a lot. In October, Forbes wrote that total tank losses for Russia stood at 1,392, with 801 of them destroyed, and the others still being repairable. We found a report from a Ukrainian source that said the Russian tank losses were more like 2,573, although that story was published 2 weeks later. Other reports stated that some Ukrainian tanks were in tip-top condition and still have surfaced because Ukrainian ammo could be used with them. Some were burned and busted with Russian soldiers taking 5 and usually 3 of them. 6% of all Russian casualties in the war have been tank crews, according to one. This is a horrible way to die, burned alive in a metal box. But it seems that overwhelm the possibility for a Russian soldier. Bear that in mind as we go on with the show. According to the government, Russia has a stock of 12,420 tanks and 30,122 armored vehicles. These numbers are for 2022, although we aren't sure if global firepower is updating the website since there are daily losses. Still, about 10,000 of the Russian tanks are for the ones being used, as you know, some are old, but some of them are modern early April 290. Now, we must ask why so many Russian tanks are situated in Ukraine. If you were to ask an analyst, they might tell you it's complicated. They'll tell you that it's more than Russian tanks being obsolete in the battlefield. That is correct. According to experts watching the war unfold, Russia has lost 237 T-72 B-3 tanks and hundreds more other iterations of T-72 that date back to decades. The country has lost in the region of 170 T-80s and 167 since their last build in 2001. So, yes, we have some pretty old tanks there, but there is more to the losses than many of the tanks perhaps not being modern enough for battle. The truth is, Russia has been using these tanks when they weren't needed, or when the deployment bungled. A military analyst based in the UK said, tanks are supposed to fight as part of combined formation.
working on the battlefield and artillery close by to support them. Otherwise, close-range anti-tank missiles will take the tanks out easily. The best-case scenario for Russian tank crews, Ukrainian anti-tank weapons and the people firing them will be destroyed or at least repulsed. This hasn't been happening anywhere near as often as Russian tank crews.
Come on.
Billions of dollars the U.S. and other countries are sending to Ukraine. A lot of the military aid consists of weapons that can easily destroy tanks, sometimes from a great distance, such as the U.S. guided multiple launch rocket systems. In September, the New York Times wrote that these have already helped defeat Russian tank numbers, but these are for long-distance warfare. The U.S. also supplies some arms to Ukraine used for close-quarters combat, including various anti-tank systems. The weapons sent from Ukraine include hundreds of Javelin anti-armor systems, each costing about $250,000. These weapons hit the tanks from above, where they're the weakest. They've been working out so far for Ukraine. The media reported the U.S. sent over to Ukraine 1,500 units of two-launched optically tracked wire-guided or TOW anti-tank missiles. Along with those, plus the Javelins, the UK added a bunch of new-generation light anti-tank weapons. Short-range weapons can be easily transported on light armored vehicles. The U.S. has sent millions of dollars worth of those over in its $54 billion package. So in terms of weapons, Ukraine right now is getting a lot of assistance. So you have old tanks, sometimes traveling without enough support, going up against some of the most formidable anti-tank weaponry there is. Is it any wonder those Russian soldiers are leaving their tanks at the side of the street and running for their lives? All they really wanted might be someone to love and they're beyond breakaway. Incineration is part of their mission. This is important. The mental aspect of this is that soldiers are not like they used to be, and their commanders are not anywhere near as brutal. Sacrificing oneself for your country seems like a raw deal these days. Although, it has to be said, back in the day, many Red Army soldiers hated Stalin, and so weren't overly keen on fighting for him. Some are feeling that way now, because, as we said, times have changed. Plus, some young men don't see Ukraine as a threat. Not a threat like the Nazis were. Some of them are more than willing to give up a hunk of their metal rather than be burned inside it. Some feel like they're being ordered around by idiots, pretty much sent to their deaths. As you said, the Russian war plan hasn't so far been great. Many news services are reporting about Russians who are no longer willing to fight. I want to go back to Ukraine and kill and be killed. He explained, we were like blind kittens. I'm shocked by our army. It didn't cost much to equip us. Why wasn't it done? He said so often they were told to move forward without any previous reconnaissance and with no protection. He makes a good point. Many people have commented on how atrocious Russian strategic efforts have been. This year, the longtime political activist, among many things, Noam Chomsky, talked about the utter incompetence of the Russian military. He's not alone in saying that. Scores of Russian soldiers who've been to the front line won't go back, and some who are there now are not willing to die. Some of them have seen traffic jams of tanks on roads where they were easily picked out by U.S. and UK-made shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons. A Russian tank crew named Alexei was there for one such attack. Later explained that everyone in the crew was shell-shocked. They had no idea what hit them. This sounds like shooting fish in a barrel. What you have is inexperienced young men taking orders that each of them don't see rational, moving around in old tanks against some of the best anti-tank weapons in the world. It used to be that tanks were the best things for taking out tanks, but now these lightweight weapons seem to give a new job, and Ukraine was being sent in all the time. The Moscow Times wrote that some of the tanks that date back to the 60s have been fitted with makeshift cables on the tops. Hardly what you call modern armor. Tank crews have also tried putting sandbags and pine logs on top of their tanks, but this won't help their chances of survival in any significant way. This is why some people say the tank age is over. They say tanks these days are just too vulnerable. Still, maybe this just applies to the old tanks. Even so, old and new tanks should be protected with explosive reactive armor, or ERA, which does what it sounds like it would do. There's also active armor, which can sense incoming missiles and intercept them before they get to the tank. Why can't Russian tanks employ defend themselves against missiles then? By the look of the battlefield, you'd think these tanks would struggle to react to become importance. So Russia has been a world leader in tank technology and armor technology. So why are its tanks not so easily? Even though Russia has the know-how to stop it from happening, one analyst had this to say about it. The attrition of Russians in battle tanks in Ukraine is highly likely, partially due to Russia's failure to fit and properly employ adequate explosive reactive armor. It is highly likely that many Russian tank crews lack the training to maintain the ERA.
leading to either poor fitting of the explosive elements of it or being left off entirely. So, this is more a human failure than it is a hardware failure, but it's more likely a bit of both. It might be down to money. Can Russia afford to protect its tanks the way they should be protected? Half the world is helping Ukraine in this war, and almost no one is helping Russia. Over $100 billion have been sent to aid Ukraine in total. The amount of weapons in those aid packages is staggering. Way too many to list here. But be assured, the Western arms industry and its shareholders are having around-the-clock parties with by-the-minute champagne toasts, just as Russian soldiers are being cooked alive by their weapons because no country is sending aid to Russia. But there's more. If you look at the video footage of Russian tanks being blown up, or if you take a close look at the dump tanks, many of them have ERAs. Some don't, but that's probably because Ukraine has already stripped it down. Well, firstly, there are various types of ERA. Some are better than others. Also, ERA will help, but a strike can still be catastrophic. A missile can still lead to deadly pop-top. The sad fact is, for Russian soldiers, their armor is less effective. 3 times less effective than the tank, according to one expert. Which means that the catastrophic kill rate in Russian tanks, especially the older ones, is really high. With the older tanks, it's more than just poor ERA or poor ERA management, but the tank's other attributes that are less than desirable. But as we said, it's more than just hardware. If you ask any analyst right now who knows this war inside and out, they'll also tell you that crappy tactics and appalling morale among troops count for a lot when it comes to that deathly landscape of fallen tanks in Ukraine. As for substandard tactics, Russian tanks often do a follow-the-leader movement, and that has been leading to bunch-ups, the fish-in-a-barrel formation. We made that formation up, of course, but you know what we mean. On top of that, as we said, you have lackluster coordination with infantry and artillery, which is just asking for trouble. Russia has done this time and again. Their tanks have been huddled up, left out in the open like blind mice among well-armed pigeons, and the majority of time, they haven't even had the slightest bit of camouflage. You gotta let the tank may not be nine, but if you think Russia has the time and money to redesign tanks to make them less vulnerable, you'd likely be wrong. Still, Hitler did once underestimate Russia's weapon-building prowess. Right now, the worst job in the world has to be a Russian tank crew. If you listen to Putin, the war in Ukraine is going swimmingly, but some ominous signs point to a very different reality. What was posted up as a few weeks war that would see Russia overrunning Kyiv has instead turned into a year-long quagmire that still has Russia fighting over the slice of Ukraine that they took in the early days, using countless soldiers and fast-dwindling equipment to battle Ukrainian defenders over sparsely populated, bombed-out cities like Bakhmut. But despite this, Putin has not taken his foot off the gas. In fact, he's gotten more belligerent than ever, frequently threatening NATO with direct retaliation. But for those reading the tea leaves, all the evidence is pointing to the fact that the Russian war effort may be reaching a disastrous turning point. The first indication that the war is going bad for Putin might be that he's increasingly belligerent. He stepped up his threats against Finland, claiming that every new step by NATO is risking nuclear war. But the person who's actually risking nuclear war is only one. He announced the suspension of the last major nuclear weapons treaty between the U.S. and Russia. Start, which took effect in 2011, only had 3 years left before it had to be renewed. But now Putin is pulling out effective immediately. This treaty allows each country to obtain information on the other country's nuclear arsenal through inspection. It was part of a larger effort post-Cold War to limit the uncontrolled growth of nuclear weapons. So what does this mean in practice? Experts say it's not the sign of strength Putin wants it to be. For one thing, Putin is now free to update his nuclear arsenal without any oversight. Russia has the world's largest nuclear arsenal, but that might be deceiving. Much like the U.S., Russia developed its nuclear arsenal during the Cold War, when the primary goal was to ensure mutually assured destruction between the two superpowers. If either one fired off a nuclear weapon, odds were that all life on Earth was going to die. That thankfully never happened, and the weapons just sat in storage for decades, waiting and biding their time. But that time might never come. Putin likes to threaten a nuclear first strike at every opportunity, but it's not clear if he could even pull it off. Nuclear weapons need to be inspected and maintained every few years to stay in working order. Not only have the Russian weapons been in storage for decades, but many of them were stored in regions of the Soviet Union that are now independent countries, including Russia. It's not clear how many Russian weapons are even still in working order, or how many experts there are in maintaining Soviet-era weapons. The U.S., which is vastly wealthier than Russia, has publicly admitted trouble in keeping its own massive stockpile properly maintained, and recently allocated billions into a modernization program, so it's doubtful Russia has its own even bigger arsenal in good working order. Now, Putin has a reason to want new and modern weapons. It's possible that his withdrawal from the New START treaty might just be a game of brinksmanship and intimidation, but it's also possible that Putin's planning to ramp up production on a modern wave of nukes. However, there are some mixed signals on that front. Only a few days after withdrawing from the treaty, Putin clarified that it was only a partial withdrawal and would not lead to the design of new weapons. This means that the only point of the move was to make Westerners even more scared about the possibility of nuclear war, a fear that Putin uses to manipulate the West into self-deterrence. Of course, like many things about the war, what Putin says and what he does might be very different. If Putin had a chance to add new and more powerful nuclear weapons that didn't date back 40 years to his arsenal, the odds are he would jump at the chance, but he's not, which indicates it might be yet another area where Russia is being frozen out. It's well known that Russia is more isolated than ever before, with most of the world sanctioning Russia and cutting it off from the global economy. Its only consistent allies are its satellite state Belarus, fellow outlaw states Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela, and a few stray countries like Nicaragua, that back it up in the way. And even a few of those countries are hesitant to back it fully. Russia's been burning through its military equipment quickly with later weapons and the determined French military tearing through the Cold War era equipment. That has limited Russia to getting new weapons from its few remaining allies, with only Iran and North Korea having the arsenal needed to provide it with suitable weapons. But there is one wild card in the picture: China. Chinese leader Xi Jinping opened the war by emphasizing China's alliance with Putin. Most analysts view China as likely a long-term ally, due to them having a vested interest in the age of conquest returning. After all, if Putin conquered Ukraine and the world grudgingly accepted it, China would have a good chance of conquering Taiwan without global intervention. Needless to say, it did not work out that way. As the war ground on and it became clear Russia would not be overrunning Kyiv anytime soon, China started hedging its bets on whether they would aid Russia during the recent United Nations vote calling on Russia to leave Ukraine. China abstained. Hardly a vote of confidence, but despite this, reports keep leaking out that China could be on the verge of giving Russia lethal weapons. Yet, they're always on the verge and never seem to take this step, at least since February 2023. Instead, China continued to try to portray itself as a rational, neutral actor, even offering a mediator peace deal with terms that were widely mocked by the West. So, why aren't they willing to make another of the West's long-term rivals? Simply put, right now, attacking Russia looks like a losing proposition. There's no indication that Russia is truly turning the corner. China has heavy investments in the rest of the world, and while China has largely turned its nose at international law, the U.S. does have one massive piece of leverage against it: secondary sanctions. These sanctions target non-U.S. persons or institutions that do business with a part of other sanctions. This is usually used to target those doing business with Iran, but it could easily be expanded to those doing business with Russia if China decides to get more directly involved. And if China is going to risk that, it's certainly not going to avoid a losing war. And it may not be in China's best interests right now. Analysts say that if China decides to give lethal aid to Russia, it would formally transform Ukraine into a proxy war and essentially kick off a full Cold War between the U.S. and China, one that could easily turn hot. And if that's going to happen, China wants it to be on its timeline. That means Russia is largely on its own as it enters the next phase of the war, but Putin is acting as confident as ever. He's looking to intimidate the world, announcing a ramp-up in weapons and likely mobilization to try to push deeper into Ukrainian territory. But neither of these might work out how he's hoping. Another bad sign for Putin came shortly after he announced the withdrawal from the New START treaty as Russia attempted to test a new intercontinental ballistic missile. There was clearly an attempt to intimidate the West and remind them that Russia could still hit them anywhere and at any time, except that it seemed like they really couldn't. The RS-28 Sa'at missile, known as the Satan-2, could carry a 10-ton payload, but reportedly failed at liftoff this time. Russian media, of course, made no mention of the test, but insiders reported that it was yet another black eye for Russia. And it may not be the only area where things are collapsing. Russia's been heavily grooming and preparing for a spring mobilization and surge full of shock and awe, designed to finish off the last of the Ukrainian invasion, begin the process of retaking the Black Sea and pushing toward the but in recent weeks the noise had quieted down, and While more Russian troops are flighting into Ukraine, they're mostly clustered around Bakhmut, where the Russians are slowly clanking down the opposition, but using far more troops in the process. Russia will need more troops, and soon. During the last mobilization, Russia resorted to a draft, which led to the biggest anti-war protests the country had ever seen. The mobilization was largely seen as a disaster, as Russia relied heavily on ethnic minority groups, often drafting young professionals with no military experience and sending them to the front lines with only weeks of training, and got little for its efforts besides more war deaths. So this time Putin is taking a different approach, conducting what's being called a silent mobilization. The first draft is still technically in effect, but this wave seems to be conducted in small dribs and drabs to avoid public attention. This is probably the biggest sign yet that Putin realizes the public is no longer on his side, and for the first time, he's acting like it matters. But the biggest sign the wheels are coming off the car for Putin might be happening not in Ukraine or Russia. In recent weeks, the discourse over the war has shifted away from the two warring countries to tiny Moldova, a former Soviet republic bordering Ukraine and Romania. While it doesn't border Russia, Russia actually does have a beachhead country, the region of Transnistria, a breakaway region that seeks independence with Russian backing. There are even Russian troops in the region, troops that could be used to surge into Ukraine and open a new front in the war. But right now, Moldova is concerned about something else. In recent weeks, Moldova saw its government collapse and Russian missiles fly over the small country. This was seen as part of a plot by Russia to collapse the government and replace the pro-Western leadership with a pro-Putin flag. But it failed utterly, as President Maya Sandu not only appointed a new pro-Western prime minister, but openly accused Putin of being behind a coup attempt, and met with Ukrainian leader Vladimir Zelensky to share details of Russia's plotting in the region. In the days after, Sandu reached out to NATO and the West for support, bringing the country closer to formally joining the alliance, which means that the West isn't just aware of Putin's actions, they're not afraid of him anymore. In the past, Putin's intimidation has meant that he's able to run roughshod over the independence of former Soviet republics. The international community watched as he annexed Crimea with impunity and interfered in the politics of border nations repeatedly. They assumed that by letting him get away with it, it would keep him from embarking on a full war of conquest, which was proven wrong in Ukraine. Putin's goal of launching the war was creating a new world order, one where he could hold all of Europe at nuclear blackmail and begin recollecting countries of the old Soviet Union. But that only happens when you win. The biggest sign the war is going badly for Putin isn't that he's loudly withdrawing from treaties or quietly calling up soldiers without a full draft or begging China for help. It's that the invasion of Ukraine was largely designed to punish Ukraine for